Let's talk about something that's, well, it's really tough. But it might just be the liberating truth you need to hear. What if the distance you feel from certain family members isn't rejection at all? What if it's actually God's protection?
Man, this really hits home, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of that specific kind of ache. It's not like a big, loud fight with an enemy. It's a quiet, cold feeling that comes from being invisible or unloved by the very people who are supposed to cherish you the most.
And that brings us to the big question we're tackling today. What if that painful separation, that feeling of being cut off, what if it's not a punishment? What if it's a shield? A protective wall that you didn't even build, but one that was built for you? Let's really dig into that.
All right, so first things first. Before we can even begin to see this as protection, we have to be real about the wound itself. We have to acknowledge that silent pain, that sting of rejection, because that's the starting point for a totally new perspective.
So how do we make that shift? How do we start to see this pain not as a curse, but as a cover? It all begins with changing our perspective, being open to the idea that this separation might be serving a much higher purpose we just can't see yet.
Okay, look at this.
This is huge. On the left, that's how it feels to us, right? Abandonment, punishment, rejection, a deep wound. But what if, from God's point of view, it's something totally different? What if abandonment is actually alignment, getting you where you need to be? Punishment is protection. Rejection is redirection. And that wound? What if it's actually a womb, a sacred space where something new is about to be born in your life?
You know, this whole idea isn't some new age concept. It's ancient. In fact, some of the most powerful stories ever told are built on this exact principle, that rejection is often the setup for your divine redirection. Let's look at some examples.
First up, Joseph. I mean, think about his story. He's betrayed by his own brothers, the people who should have had his back. They throw him in a pit and sell him off. To him, it must have felt like game over. But from that higher perspective, that pit wasn't his grave. It was a doorway. It was the brutal first step on a crazy path that led straight to a palace.
And here's the absolute key to understanding it. Joseph's big dream, his destiny, it couldn't have survived in that house, surrounded by all that jealousy. Just like the quote says, sometimes God allows distance because closeness would destroy you. That separation was actually preservation. It was necessary. When you lay it out like this, the pattern is so clear. The betrayal leads to isolation, but that isolation becomes the training ground where he's tested and transformed. And only after that transformation does he get elevated. And look at that last step, the reunion. It couldn't happen when he was weak. It could only happen once he was whole and in a position of strength.
Okay, now let's shift to Moses. Here's a guy full of passion who tries to step up and save his people. And what does he get for it? Total rejection. They basically laugh in his face and say, "Who made you boss?" Can you imagine the humiliation?
And just like with Joseph, that rejection was the trigger. It drove him out into the wilderness. But that wasn't a punishment. It was his preparation. It was out there, in the quiet, away from all the noise and expectations, that he could finally hear God's real call from a burning bush. That rejection wasn't a dead end. It was the doorway to his destiny.
And then we've got David. He's about to face Goliath, literally the biggest giant of his life. And what does he hear from his family in that moment? Not encouragement, scorn. His own brother accuses him of being arrogant, trying to drag him into a petty family squabble right before the most important fight of his life.
David's response here is everything. He just turns away. He doesn't get sucked into the drama. He keeps his eyes on the giant. And the lesson is so incredibly powerful. You do not need your family's permission slip to fulfill God's assignment for your life. Their disapproval doesn't disqualify you. It just clarifies where the real battle is.
So if God sometimes has to create distance between you and your biological family, does he just leave you alone? No way. Not at all. This actually opens the door to something beautiful, the family that you find. It's about redefining your circle.
You know, Jesus himself brought up this exact idea. When his mom and brothers showed up, he looked around at the people who were there to hear his message and said, "These are my mother and brothers." He was redefining family right then and there, shifting it from being about bloodline to being about purpose. And get this, it comes with an absolutely incredible promise. For every relationship you might have to let go of to follow your calling, God promises a 100-fold return, 100 times more. Not just replacing what was lost, but giving you an abundance of new, supportive people who will champion you,
your true spiritual family.
This quote just nails it, doesn't it? At the end of the day, family isn't just about a shared history. It's about who's willing to walk with you into your God-given future. The protection isn't about leaving you isolated. It's about clearing the path for the people who are actually meant to walk on it with you.
All right. Finally, let's talk about the silence. Because sometimes the protection isn't some big, dramatic event. It's just quiet. The phone stops ringing, the invitations dry up. What if that silence isn't abandonment? What if it's a sacred shield?
We see this pattern everywhere in these stories. God silenced Zechariah to protect a fragile new promise from doubt. Jesus created a little distance at the wedding in Cana to make sure he was on God's timing, not his family's. Gideon had to literally tear down his family's idols to step into his purpose. And Abraham couldn't receive his full promise until he finally separated from Lot. See, in every case, the silence and the space were essential tools for what God was doing next.
And this is what it all comes down to. This is the big idea, the perspective shift we've been building toward this whole time. Some rejections are really just redirections, and some silences, they're sacred shields. It's not about pretending it doesn't hurt. It's about finding the purpose inside the pain.
So I leave you with this to think about. What if you started to reframe your own story? Instead of just focusing on the pain of who you lost, what if you also started to see the protection you gained? Just take a moment and ask yourself, who has God distanced from my life? And how, just maybe, might that be one of the greatest mercies he's ever shown me?